Hi, everyone, and thank you to this panel. Thank you for attending this panel on past pandemics and public policy. We're going to talk about the importance of communicating science today, which I think comes at a very, unfortunately, apropos moment in not just history here in North America, but in other parts of the world as well. And we'll be doing this through the lens of historical materials to show that this is, in fact, not a new discussion. With me today, my name is Ray Rutherford. I'm the publisher for Wiley Digital Archives, and we're very happy to have with us Dr. Alexander Rutherford, the professor of psychology from the University of Toronto, Dr. Jeff Browell, who is the head of archives and research at King's College, London, and Dr. Alexander Hall, who is a member of the Science, Knowledge, and Belief in Society Research Group at the University of Birmingham, and also the section recorder in the History of Science section for the British Science Association. What we're going to be covering today is the way that science and the way that science is communicated has an impact on public policy. And specifically, we'll be examining some material from academic societies, learned societies, colleges in the sense of the Royal College of Physicians or others, not necessarily academic institutions in that sense, who have helped to influence and shape public policy through their research and through the way that research is communicated. And what we've been doing at Wiley and with myself as the publisher have been digitizing materials from these archives to present them in ways that inform research, teaching, and education, while also offering a lens into the past that might inform the future. The program itself is currently at 5 archives and growing. There's a focus on natural sciences, environmental history, but STEM more largely. To date, there's about 7 million images, including some 250,000 maps, for example, from the Royal Geographical Society. And as I mentioned earlier, Alex Hall is with the British Science Association, and we have digitized the archives of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, which is the earlier or former iteration of that same organization. Wiley has put these onto an archive-specific platform that's quite different from our Wiley Online Library environment, as archival materials need to be investigated a little more specifically. So I wanted to lead off quickly with an example of what we'll be talking about today. And in looking at the archives of the New York Academy of Sciences, I had come across this letter from a doctor, a CUNY doctor at Mount Sinai in New York City, and he was arguing to get scientists onto Johnny Carson. If you're old enough like me to remember Johnny Carson, he felt that the United States, and I'm quoting here, surprisingly antagonistic to science. The outlook for science is darkened. Funds for government research grants have been frozen, and that American scientists have failed too. And this is closer to home and what we're speaking about today, and failing to show their fellow citizens that science, not technology, is a significant human occupation and a vital national resource. So as you can imagine, a letter like this resonates through time. We see now just slogans that say "Believe Science," right? And we see decidedly anti-expert, anti-science sentiment within certain populations in many different countries, whether it's a cultural movement, a political movement, or even a religious movement or anti-movement. And our speakers are going to talk today a little bit about archival materials, the way that they inform research into an important topic like this, and the way that those materials might help to inform and educate science policy and regulation ultimately, and compliance with regulation moving forward. So I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Alexander Hall, Alex, and jump into his first slide here.
Thank you, Ray. And as Ray just mentioned there, as well as working at the University of Birmingham, I'm also the History of Science section recorder at the British Science Association, which was originally known as the British Society for the Advancement of Science. And this organization was founded in 1831 to promote and democratize access to science and scientific knowledge. And a guiding principle from the early years was to improve the perception and understanding of science in society. And they've held annual conferences ever since, as we can see on the slide here. This is a meeting in 1863. Originally, those conferences looked like what we might today recognize as a scientific conference, people reading new papers, new findings. Today, as the association has changed, it's called the British Science Festival. It's much more oriented towards getting children, families, adults into science and engaging with new scientific research. I'm a 20th century historian, though, so I'm not particularly an expert in these early years of the BAAS. But what I am interested in my research is how science communication has adapted over the years and how scientists may have used popular and public communication methods, but also private lobbying and organizations to work with policy formation. The BAS emerged in the 19th century as part of a professionalizing period for science in the UK. And as the organization sought to organize professional scientists to influence society in a positive way. And as well as this professionalization, part of the early movement was in efforts to separate science from other bodies of authority in society, whether that's religious institutions, regional government structures, and it gave an organized, systematic way of pressuring government for scientific input into processes around law and policy. Okay, next slide, please, Ray. So when I began speaking with Wiley and heard that they were digitizing the BAS collections, I originally did some scoping, soliciting the views of historians of science, just to see, you know, what this project, what the kind of archive they would want would look like, and those kind of things. And several early on raised this kind of usual concerns about access, paywalls, and I was kind of surprised because I kind of saw things almost the polar opposite. This could be generational. I kind of sought out the advice of some senior professors. It could be that. For me, the physical records remain as accessible as they always have been there at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. But this project improves the access, so we have an equity of access, you know, for the differently abled, but also for those researching in lots of different geographical locations, especially if we're serious about decolonizing disciplines. An digitized archive allows people in the global south and other areas to potentially access these things. And then obviously there, I've mentioned remote working. That's become hugely apparent in 2020, as I have a book project that's unable to be finished because another archive I need does not have any digitized collections. But then also we can think actually beyond that kind of simple things that a digitized collection can do for a historian to actually the analytical ability that comes with this. The comprehensive database, the ability to see networks of connections beyond the individual institutions, and to cross-examine against multiple sources. And this is one of the things that's very interesting for me when we're thinking about digitizing the records of an academic society or group like the BAS. We can start to see the networks and context that scientists were working in, that individual collections cannot often do. So quite often we might have a personal collection attached to an individual scientist, and you get one perspective from that, but that kind of promotes this idea that these people are doing this work on their own or with a small group of colleagues. And so I thought I'd just quickly bring in an example from my own research here, that where this kind of archive and collection being digitized can really help me. And so one of the people I'm interested in my current work is Julian Huxley, the grandson of T.H. Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, the brother of Aldous Huxley, the famous science fiction writer. Julian Huxley was one of the most prominent and influential scientists and public intellectuals in the UK in the 20th century. Despite being, you know, widely known and widely cited among historians today, there's no major single comprehensive treatment of his life or work, his life and work. This is partly due to the vast and disparate areas he worked in, but it's also because he didn't really have a traditional academic career. After his late 20s, he never had a traditional role in a university institution. But also on a practical level, his personal archive is held in the Woodson Research Center in the Fondren Library at Rice University in the USA, which in a normal year is difficult for me to access, but in these kind of times has been even harder. And I'm particularly interested in, as you can see from the images here, Julian Huxley's broadcasting career. We have him recording an early 1920s radio show there, and also as part of one of the first panel shows, the Brains Trust, which originally ran as a radio program and then became a television show later in the 1960s, where experts from different disciplines would answer questions from the public. And being interested in his broadcast work, the records for this are largely only accessible via the BBC written archives, which remarkably don't have a publicly searchable catalogue or even a database. So for those, I'm reliant on the skills of archivists at the BBC, which I can happy to say they're very good. But often the result is a fragmentary picture. It's one that in many instances places too much agency on single individuals. So from the BBC records, I often don't really see much of Julian Huxley's input in the development of a show. I can see the production decisions taken usually largely around budgets. Now, Huxley was a man of letters. He worked within very wide-ranging networks. And it's interesting to see something that I've picked up now with looking at the BAS records, is the way he was doing a very public campaigning kind of role, but also behind the scenes lobbying for things that he wanted. And this becomes apparent only with these digitized records. At the BBC, he sat on several advisory committees, mainly the Talks Advisory Committee. And basically, it seems to be the only reason he was on this committee was to keep badgering them to have more radio science programs. At the same time, the BBC were receiving petitions about science content and science broadcasting. One of these petitions was led by the BAAS. Well, now looking at those records at the other end at the BAAS collection, we can see that actually it was Huxley leading this movement with the organization. So he was using his influence within the BAAS to campaign for more broadcasting on science, and at the same time using his position within the BBC advisory committees to do the same thing. And I just thought that was a neat example of showing how we can kind of find more about these networks and webs and how individuals are moving in and around them. I think I'll leave it there and probably run over a little.
That's okay. Thank you, Alex. And yeah, I can imagine there's some frustration with work that's in progress due to the closure of the closure of the added hurdle in visiting Texas just right now. Now we have Dr. Alexandra Rutherford. Alexandra, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. If you could, that's great. So I'll just get started by giving a few more introductions. I come to the session wearing a variety of different hats, and each of them touches on a different aspect, I think, of this topic and this project. So first of all, I'm an editor of a journal that Wiley publishes, the Journal of the History of the Behavioral Sciences. And in fact, many of the folks that I want to support in terms of publishing in the journal publish in the areas of geography and anthropology, areas in which the Wiley Digital Archives has some really important holdings. So I'm interested in really supporting the use of these records to get quality research published in the journal. I'm also a professor, of course. I'm also a historian of psychology myself. I happen to be in a psychology department, but I'm actually a historian who's interested in history of the social and behavioral sciences. And vis-a-vis this session, my specific research interest is in fact the relationship of psychological science to society, to social issues, and to policy making. So I will speak about that a little bit more in a second. I'm also the chair of an advisory board of a brick and mortar archives, the Archives of the History of American Psychology, in fact. And as I sort of participate in, advising a brick and mortar archives in this increasingly digital world we live in, it's interesting for me to see what possibilities there are, where we have to move forward with that, and to give advice in that regard. Finally, in addition to being a person who teaches, a person who does research, I'm also very interested in developing digitally accessible materials. So, oh gosh, about 10 years ago now, I started doing an oral history project, and it seemed to me 10 years ago that there's no point in sticking away our transcripts in a brick and mortar archive, although we will do that as well, but that it was important to make them accessible through the web. And so we've in fact just relaunched a new a new website for the project that makes all of these materials, oral history interviews that we do with self-identified feminist psychologists to chart the relationship between feminism and psychology. So come there. But one of the things I do too is that I'm a teacher. And so I think Alex has spoken already to the value of having digital materials accessible in teaching and training how to do history. I'm a coordinator of a historical, theoretical, and critical studies of psychology graduate program, and all of our graduate students are in a position to be benefiting from the accessibility of digital archives in their own work. Okay, but to the topic at hand today, and that is science, the public policy, and the value of history. This, of course, touches sort of directly on a current project that I'm working at, in which I am attempting to reconstruct the efforts of feminist social scientists in their efforts to influence policy. And I'm looking at several areas: violence against women, women's mental health, and women and work. And I'm reconstructing this influence from basically the post-World War II period to the present. And I think this is my larger interest in this. Is that I think it's really important to use history to analyze the strategies and successes of scientists in shaping public policy, as well as the resistance to their work, right? That's what we're facing at this current moment, is when have there been successes? When are scientists, and in my case, specifically feminist scientists, when do they have success in influencing public policy? When is there resistance to that? And can we use historical case studies to understand some of this resistance in the present? We know that we're at a particularly tenuous moment right now in terms of trust in science. And in fact, in the history of feminist science, there has been longstanding mistrust of feminist science because of its ostensibly value-laden quality from the outset. So I think it's a particularly interesting case study to examine these dynamics. Obviously, in my own work, professional and scientific societies have been incredibly important and increasingly important throughout the 20th century in being involved in advocacy efforts that extend beyond strictly professional and guild issues and actually move into the area of public policy. But this hasn't been a seamless or uncontested development. It hasn't been until, in fact, about the 1970s and 80s that within psychological science, it has been more or less accepted that science should be used to influence public policy, that there are important roles for the social sciences to play in this regard. Ray, if you could go to the next slide. So just to kind of elaborate a little bit on this briefly, the archival material that can be used here is, of course, multiple, but in my own work, even looking at meeting minutes, committee and task force reports, amicus briefs, and other documents generated by scientific societies is indispensable to tracing some of these dynamics. How have scientists leveraged empirical data to influence policy? What role have societies played in supporting this work, and how has this role changed over time are some of the key questions that I address. I've given here a couple of examples of the kinds of events in the history of social science in my field that have been very important in terms of public policy. And many of you in the US especially will know of the Brown v. Board decision of 1954, in which the segregation of public schools by race was declared unconstitutional. That was the first time social science research was used to influence a Supreme Court decision. And a particular society, in fact, the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, was really involved in supporting the scientists who wrote the statement for that case. As a former SPICY historian, I can tell you that those society documents are really important for reconstructing the complexity of those moves to influence such an influential decision. More recently, the American Psychological Association, another scientific and professional society, has been involved in preparing amicus briefs to support the possibility of same-sex marriage legislation. So again, just some different examples of the importance of these documents and understanding these relationships. And just to conclude, I'll just highlight something that Alex has already mentioned. Access to a temporally and geographically expansive archive, such as the one that that Wiley's developing presents opportunities for charting patterns over time and across national contexts. So instead of looking at individual societies, you can also look across societies and across national contexts, which I think is really increasingly a place that historians are going as well. So I think I will leave it there and pass it along to Jeffrey.
Thank you, Dr. Rutherford. And I want to note, Alex and Alexandra, you both talked about 20th century research, right? The post-World War II period you were focusing on. And as someone who's been digitizing archives for about 15 years or so, I think what's exciting to me, and I think maybe to librarians and to researchers, is that because we're working with societies, we don't have to worry as much about the barrier that copyright imposes, because the societies own most of these collections and works. So for example, the Royal Geographical Society goes right through the 1980s. The New York Academy of Sciences goes up to 2009. You know, the BAAS will likely go up into the 1980s as well. So it's been frustrating for a lot of researchers that we're in World War I, the interwar period, and all these other exciting, historically interesting periods have been sort of blocked off because of rights issues, and working with societies has alleviated some of those barriers, and maybe provided more opportunity for research that's more expansive. So our last speaker today is Dr. Jeff Browell. Jeff is the head of archives at King's College London. And I should lastly just note that King's College is one of the institutions that is contributing material to the BAAS archive, as they met. The BAAS met at different institutions over time. It was like a revolving meeting. So the collections are housed at different universities across the the UK, not just at the Bodleian. Jeff?
Thanks, Ray. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Wiley for inviting us to participate in the project, by being able to digitize the papers of Charles Wheatstone. He was a 19th century polymath. He was a professor of experimental philosophy at King's College London, of physics. And he was also a public scientist in the true sense of the word in the 19th century, lobbying, raising money. He was an active businessman in his own right. He invented one of the earliest, most successful telegraph apparatus and some of the earliest undersea cables. So he's very interested in the legislation and international agreements that would be required to make communications between different nations work properly. I'm excited to include that material in this project, so very soon everyone will be able to delve in greater detail. So very quickly, just a bit of background about learned societies. Growth in the UK mainly from the 1830s, and there are a number of reasons for that: legal, communications, and so on, literacy. And often they look to create internal codes, frameworks, disciplines, and their own vocabularies. And I think that's probably the single most important lesson, I'd say, from current digitization, and that is the value of agreed vocabularies to enable cross-searching between different tranches of data, either in a corpus like WISE or between that and other corpuses internationally, so that researchers can find what they want. So even in the 19th century, there were many examples of the collection of archives, the use of archives and literature to support public health campaigns, food standards later on. And of course, everyone's familiar with the mid-19th century debate around Darwinism. And there was a tension all the way between the academy and popular science and the idea of gentlemen's clubs and applied or professional disciplines. So at King's, we also hold the papers of the Royal British Nurses Association, which is the first professional association for nurses anywhere. And it was one of a number of organizations in the late 19th century that split. There were members who had different beliefs about the direction of travel of these societies, that they should either be for the benefit of members or that they should be to the benefit of the wider community. So there's no easy answer there on that. Can I have the next slide?
Yes, sorry.
So one of the things that I always bang on about in talks is the value of archives and archivists, and the importance of archivists to contextualize our work and contextualize collections, and also their value in the community more broadly as figures of trust, hopefully, as the people that legislators, that journalists, that members of the public will go to for independent arbitration. It doesn't mean that the archives that they preserve are necessarily objective. It just means that they have an understanding of their provenance and of their value, hopefully, between researchers, so at the center of the research network. And in recent years in the UK, there have been a number of important inquiries, public inquiries, that have brought this to light. One was the Hillsborough inquiry. So this related to a football stadium disaster in 1989 that resulted in the deaths of 95 football fans. There was an inquest at the time that blamed Liverpool football fans for the disaster, essentially. But fans and their families refused to accept this. And a few years later, the inquiry was reopened. And the important aspect of this, and what this ended up bringing about, was action against the police. So there were various individuals who were blamed and then cases brought against them. So this was a triumph for the families involved. And the archive that was created as part of the inquiry was really absolutely central to this, central to the negotiation of trust between the legal bodies, between the public watching and also the members' families, the victims' families. It was a public archive and it was a digital archive. So this is an early example of the value of a level playing field where the archivist is the adjudicator or the referee. Another more recent example, there's an independent inquiry into child sex abuse, which has been going on in the UK for a number of years, and one also on tainted blood. So blood that was infected with hepatitis or HIV during transfusion, and that's currently underway, and the inquiry team are actually visiting my archive right now to get to the bottom of what's going on. And as archivists, we have to look forward in time and anticipate what uses our collections might be put to in the future, and that's very difficult. We have to be time travelers. So in all this activity, the archivist plays a central role. An example of that is the Madagascar project that I was involved with. So this was to create an archive catalogue and digitisation in Africa to link collections for economic benefit, for societal benefit, so for civil society, the development of civil society, and also for health. Next slide, please. So very quickly, because I know we've only got a minute or two, looking to the future, there are all sorts of big questions that we have to address. So how do we create a sort of level playing field in the collection of data and the collection of archives relating to big scientific questions that are often very political, like global warming, and currently COVID-19, this big COVID collecting program underway in the UK, and I know there are other countries that have them as well. And how do we really link in the GLAM sector or the heritage sector into bigger funding streams that address global problems? And that's where the Africa project that I mentioned achieved that to a very small extent. There's a lot more money out there looking not just at research and how you use a collection for research, but how you use it to help solve world problems. That's a current thing that we need to address, and it's a future challenge that we need to address. And lastly, what, therefore, does the Learned Society Archive and Library look? How do we address those issues? How do we provide access to this sort of material and collect it and preserve it for the future? Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. And that future question is one that I've had the opportunity to be on the edge on, and by that what I mean is that with the New York Academy of Sciences, As we got into the 2000s, the archivists there started keeping faxes and facsimile cover sheets and then printing out emails, right? And then, you know, at what point did the physical archive become the digital archive? And then now we're printing out the digital archive so that it can be a physical archive. And then that stopped when more trust developed in the technology for preserving material, making it, you know, accessible outside of a floppy disk in 20 years time. So that future question is one that I think all libraries and archives are engaged in as well. If you think about a researcher 20 years from now doing research on COVID-19, they may have the ability to run a translated search across multiple languages and sources and search local papers in Singapore, you know, and look at just as easily as they might look for local papers in Virginia. So what does comprehensive research look like on a subject when a translated world is at your feet and digitized for you know, a global event that might have records in every single community in the, you know, the global sense. So it's an interesting connection. I think it's one that we're all, you know, we're either on the sort of current research or the historical research side in many senses, but I do think that in reality that's an artificial barrier. And by connecting these historical archives of science to current research, we're going some of the way towards making progress on devolving that barrier a little bit, but I think it will be present for some time to come. I want to thank all of our speakers this afternoon, especially those in the UK who are just going into lockdown again today, and it's late in the evening, and to Dr. Rutherford, who's with us from Toronto. And I appreciate everyone's time and attention today. If you, I know we're at time and that questions aren't really conducive in the Zoom world, but our emails are up here and there'll be a recording of the presentation. And I'd invite you to reach out to me or to any of the panels we were lucky to have this afternoon for further questions. Thank you very much.